It is Easter Sunday, 1722, and a Dutch explorer named Jacob Roggeveen is watching canoes cut through open Pacific swells toward his ship. What he sees does not match what history will later claim he found: a broken people, a ruined island, the smoking wreckage of a civilization that destroyed itself. The Rapa Nui paddling toward him are confident, skilled, alive. Within 150 years, 97% of them will be dead. But here is what the textbooks never tell you. The forest was not gone when Roggeveen arrived. The statues were not the cause of the collapse. The story you were taught about Easter Island, that parable about greedy islanders who cut down every last tree to drag their enormous stone heads across the island, is not a historical finding. It is a story that someone needed to be true. The actual catastrophe has a different shape, and it has names attached to it. One of them is Roggeveen. Another is Alexander Salmon Jr., who in the 1870s helped sell the last people who could read the island's ancient writing into Peruvian slavery. So who really killed Rapa Nui? But before our journey begins, please take a moment to like the video and subscribe. It's a simple and wonderful way to support the channel, and it means a great deal to me. I'm also always curious to know where in the world and at what time you're joining me tonight. And while you are down there, I would love to know, does reframing Easter Island as a story of colonial destruction change our moral obligation to the Rapa Nui people today? Or is the damage simply too complete to matter? It is Easter Sunday, 1722, and the sea between the Dutch ships and the island is alive with canoes. They come from the shore in the early light, paddling outward through the swells with a sureness that Roggeveen's sailors cannot quite account for. These are not the hesitant movements of a people who have learned to fear what comes from the water. There is no hanging back, no cautious watching from the beach. The canoes move with purpose, with something close to joy. The paddlers working in long practice strokes, their bodies reading the ocean the way a reader reads a familiar page, fluently, without effort, without the need to sound out every word. The sea is their inheritance and their medium, and they are at home in it, the way that men who have never left their birth city are at home on their own streets, utterly unreflectively, in the bones. Jacob Roggeveen stands at the rail of his ship and watches them come. He is 62 years old, a Dutch navigator in the service of the Dutch West India Company, and he has spent the better part of this voyage looking for something that does not exist: a great southern continent that European mapmakers have placed in the Pacific like a counterweight to all the landmass of the north. A landmass they need to be there because the alternative, an ocean this enormous, with this little in it, seems to them impossible. He has found no continent. What he has found instead, on this Sunday morning in the year of our Lord 1722, is something his charts do not contain and his categories cannot immediately hold. He has found an island, small and green and volcanic, rising from the most remote reach of the largest ocean on the planet, and the island is coming out to meet him. His logbook will record what he sees with the careful, bewildered precision of a man who understands that he is witnessing something outside his experience and is determined to set it down accurately, regardless. He notes the canoes. He notes the confidence of the paddlers. He notes that the people who approach his ships are healthy and well-formed, that they carry offerings, that they show no sign of the wariness or the submission that European explorers have by this point come to expect and sometimes to demand from the peoples they encounter on the edges of the world. They are in the process of claiming. What Roggeveen cannot yet see What he lacks the framework to see, even when it is directly in front of him, is the full dimension of what he has arrived at. From the water, from the deck of a Dutch ship in the early morning of April 5th, the island presents itself as coastline and elevation, as surf breaking on black volcanic rock, as green slopes rising toward the interior. But along that coastline, on raised stone platforms that run like a spine along the shore, there are figures, stone figures, enormous, facing inland with their backs to the sea, their long-eared profiles cutting the sky with an authority that has nothing to do with European aesthetics and everything to do with a sculptural tradition that has been developing on this island for centuries, slowly, patiently, with the accumulated skill of generations of craftsmen who understood that they were making something meant to outlast them. Roggeveen sees them. He writes about them. He cannot fully process them. He calls them remarkable. He does not have another word. What he is looking at is the work of 5 centuries, the people who build these figures, who quarry the soft volcanic tuff from the interior crater of Rana Raraku, who shape the stone with basalt picks, who transport the finished figures across the island's terrain and raise them on their platforms without the wheel. Without draft animals, without any of the mechanical advantages that European civilization takes for granted. These people are not a Oa, primitive society struggling to survive on a difficult island. They are a civilization at the height of its ambition. They grow sweet potato and taro in carefully engineered garden plots, their agricultural knowledge refined across generations of working a small and demanding landscape. They fish the deep water in ocean-worthy canoes, reading currents and stars with a navigational sophistication that will not be fully appreciated by the outside world for another 2 centuries. Their social structure is complex, their ceremonial life rich, their understanding of the sky sufficiently precise that they can align their stone platforms with the movements of celestial bodies in ways that still astonish researchers who study them today. And they have written it all down, somewhere on this island, in the hands of the priests and scholars who are the keepers of knowledge. There are wooden tablets in size with a script that exists nowhere else on Earth. Rongorongo, a system of writing invented independently, one of only a handful of such inventions in all of human history, in all the time that human beings have been leaving marks on surfaces to tell each other things that need to outlast the moment. The tablets hold what the tablets hold. Genealogies, perhaps, ritual texts, astronomical observations, the accumulated record of a civilization's relationship with its own history. No one from the outside world knows the tablets exist yet. No one from the outside world will be able to read them when they are finally discovered. But on this Easter morning in 1722, the knowledge is still alive, still held in living minds, still being passed from teacher to student in the long, unbroken chain of transmission. That is how civilizations carry themselves forward through time. The canoes reach the ships. What happens next is a performance of civility across a chasm so wide that neither side can see the other shore. The Rapa Nui offer gifts. The Dutch sailors receive them. Gestures are made that both sides interpret as friendly, because both sides want this to be friendly, because goodwill is the posture that makes sense in the opening moments of an encounter before either party understands what is actually at stake. There is touching. This is unremarkable to everyone present. The sailors reach down from the rail. The islanders reach up from the canoes. Hands meet over the water in the ancient human gesture of greeting, of acknowledgement, of the tentative mutual recognition that here is another person. Here is another mind. Here is something that deserves to be treated with the basic consideration that we extend to our own kind. Rogvin's log does not linger on this. It is a navigator's log, not a philosopher's. It records what is useful for navigation and trade and the business of the company that is paying for this voyage. It does not record the names of the islanders who paddle out to meet the Dutch ships, because it does not occur to Rogviman that their names are the kind of thing that needs to be preserved. It does not record what they say to each other across the language barrier, what sounds they make in the attempt to communicate, what laughter or confusion or curiosity passes between them in the few hours of this strange and unrepeatable morning. It does not record the precise moment when something goes wrong. We do not know what triggers it. We do not know if it is a movement misread, a gesture misinterpreted, the sudden panic of armed men who are very far from home and very aware of how badly things can go when you are outnumbered and surrounded by people whose intentions you cannot reliably assess. What we know is that at some point in the course of this first contact, Rogvin's men open fire. A dozen Rapa Nui die on the volcanic rock of their own coastline, on the same stone their ancestors consecrated and shaped over 500 years, on ground that has known their feet since the first canoe of settlers arrived from eastern Polynesia in a voyage of such audacious navigational precision that it still seems, even now, more like legend than like history. Rogvin weighs anchor before the day is out. He sails away with his logs and his incomprehension, with his inability to fully account for what he has seen or what he has done, with the notes that will eventually be published and read in Europe as the discovery of a curiosity, a strange island, strange statues, strange people, interesting, remarkable, now receding in the wake of a Dutch ship heading back toward the world that considers it Saule, of the center of all things. He takes with him the dead, in the sense that a man carries the dead when he has made them and then left them behind. He takes with him his failure to understand, and he leaves behind something he cannot see on every surface his sailors have touched, the gunwales of the canoes, the offerings passed from hand to hand, the skin of every islander who reached up in greeting and felt a European hand close briefly around their own. There are passengers. Viral, bacterial, the accumulated microbial inheritance of a civilization that has been trading diseases across continents for centuries and has, in the process, developed partial immunities that it does not know it has, because you do not know what you have survived until you watch someone else fail to survive it. The Rapa Nui have no such immunities. They have been isolated in the middle of the Pacific for 1,000 years, longer perhaps, and their immune systems are as innocent of the Old World's diseases as their charts are innocent of the Old World's geography. They do not know what has just been given to them. They cannot know. It is invisible. It has no name in any language they speak. The morning is over. The ships are small on the horizon now, and then they are gone, and the sea is the sea again, wide and blue and indifferent, and the island is the island. The garden plots, the fishing canoes pulled up on the beach, the sound of the interior, the smell of the Peninsula, the smell of volcanic earth and salt air, and the particular quality of light that falls on this place and nowhere else. Life resumes its rhythms. The dead are mourned in whatever way the living mourn them, with whatever ceremony and grief this civilization has developed across its centuries for the task of losing people who should not yet be lost. The Muai stand on their platforms along the coast, their backs to the sea as they were built to stand. They face inland, toward the living, toward the villages and the garden plots and the children playing in the middle distance, and the old men who remember, the old stories and the young priests who are learning the marks on the tablets by heart, tracing the incised lines with their fingers in the lamplight, committing to memory what cannot be allowed to be forgotten. The Moi watch over all of it with the patient stone faces of ancestors who have been charged with a responsibility that does not end, to witness, to protect, to hold the continuity of a people in their carved and sightless gaze. They have stood here through drought and abundance, through the long, patient centuries of a civilization building itself into permanence. They have seen the horizon in every weather and every season. They have seen the ships before, or canoes that were ships in the only sense that mattered, the vessels of the navigators who first found this place and made it home. They do not know what they have just seen. They do not know that the ships that have just disappeared over the horizon are different from every vessel that has come before, that they carry something in their wake more lethal than any weapon Rogovin's sailors fired this morning, that the world that built these figures and tended these gardens and inscribed these tablets and navigated these waters is now, as of this Easter Sunday in 1722, already ending, already beginning the long, terrible process of being unmade by forces it has no name for and no defense against. The Muai stand and watch. The living go about their lives. The children play. The old men tell the old stories. The priests trace the marks on the tablets by heart. The world is ending, and the morning still looks like any other morning. Before the ships, before the guns, before the invisible passengers in the salt air, there was only the ocean and the knowledge of how to cross it. Turn away now. Turn away from Rogovin's 3 vessels and their cannon smoke and their invisible cargo of ruin. Turn away from 1722 and sail back through the centuries, back through the long corridor of open water, back to a morning that has no catastrophe in it. Only the sea and the silence and a man standing at the prow of a double-hulled voyaging canoe somewhere in the vast blue middle of the Pacific, reading the world with every instrument his body possesses. His name is Matu'a. He is the first chief. He is sailing toward an island he has never seen. Understand what this means. Not in the language of legend, not in the soft vocabulary of myth, but in the precise and demanding language of navigation. He is somewhere between eastern Polynesia and the speck of volcanic rock, 63 square miles in size, adrift in an ocean that covers 1/3 of the surface of the Earth. There is no compass. There is no chart. There are no instruments of any kind that the civilizations of Europe or Asia would recognize as such. And yet Matu'a is not lost. He is not guessing. He is reading. He reads the stars near the horizon, where their positions are most sensitive to the latitude of the observer, where the margin of error is smallest and the information most precise. He reads the long oceanic swells that travel thousands of miles without dissipating, swells that carry in their rhythm and direction the encoded memory of distant weather systems, distant land masses, distant realities that his eyes cannot yet reach. He reads these swells not with instruments, but with the soles of his feet, through the hull of the canoe, through the subtle pressure of water against wood, a sensation so refined and so deliberately cultivated that it constitutes a form of knowledge as rigorous as any mathematics. He reads the flight paths of birds, the golden plover, the frigate bird, the tern, because birds at the edge of their range are flying toward land, and a man who knows how to read a bird knows which way land lies, even when the horizon is empty in every direction. This is not mysticism. This is science. It is science without instruments, science transmitted entirely through living memory and embodied practice. Science so sophisticated that modern researchers with satellite positioning and computational models have spent decades attempting to reconstruct its principles and have not finished. The Polynesian navigational tradition is, by any honest measure, one of the great scientific achievements in the history of the human species, and Matu'a carries it in his body, in his memory, in the accumulated inheritance of a seafaring people whose maritime tradition has no equal anywhere in the ancient world. He does not drift. He arrives. The distance from eastern Polynesia to Rapa Nui is at minimum 2,000 miles. It may be considerably more, depending on the origin point of the voyage, and scholars who have devoted their careers to this question have not settled it. What they have settled is this: the voyage was deliberate. The canoes were provisioned. The settlers brought with them not only food for the crossing, but the seeds and cuttings and animal stock necessary to found a civilization on the other side. They brought sweet potato and taro, banana and sugarcane, the chicken and the rat that will become permanent features of the island's ecology. They brought, in other words, not just themselves, but the biological and cultural infrastructure of a new world. This is not the act of people who stumbled upon an island. This is the act of people who intended to build something. What they find when they arrive is small. 63 square miles of volcanic rock, shaped by the collision of 3 ancient lava flows, treeless on the coast, verdant in its interior, ringed by reefs and battered by the swells of the most unforgiving ocean on the planet. It is, by any practical measure, an improbable place to build a civilization. It is too far from everything. Its soil is thin, its fresh water is limited. Its timber, while present, is finite. The margin for error is narrower here than almost anywhere else on Earth where human beings have chosen to make their home. The Rapa Nui read this island the way Matu'a read the ocean, carefully, attentively, with a precise and patient understanding that there is no margin for carelessness, that the land they have arrived on is the only land they have, and that the ocean surrounding it, however masterfully they navigate it, offers no escape from the consequences of mismanagement. They terrace the hillsides. They build garden plots engineered to retain moisture in the volcanic soil, to concentrate the meager rainfall, to protect the crops from the wind that comes off the sea without interruption. They practice a form of lithic mulching, covering the garden soil with small stones that absorb heat during the day and release it slowly through the night, extending the growing season, moderating the temperature, protecting the roots of the sweet potato from the cold. This technique is not obvious. It is not instinctive. It is the product of careful observation sustained across generations, of a people paying close and sustained attention to the behavior of their land and adjusting their practice accordingly. It is agriculture as a form of listening. They fish the deep water in ocean-worthy canoes, reading the currents and the seasons of the fish with the same attentiveness their ancestors brought to open ocean navigation. They develop an intimate knowledge of their island's ecology, its bird populations, its insect communities, its soil chemistry, its rainfall patterns, that constitutes, in effect, a science of place. They are not passive inhabitants of their environment. They are its students and its stewards, in continuous dialogue with a landscape they understand to be both generous and finite, and they build. The ahu rise from the volcanic coastline like altars to the horizon, stone platforms assembled without mortar, fitted with a precision that has astonished every engineer who has studied them. They are not decorative. They are not the products of a society with surplus energy and nothing better to do. They are declarations of clan identity, of ancestral presence, of the continuity between the living and the dead. That is, for the Rapa Nui, not a metaphor but a governing principle of existence. The Moai stand on the Ahu, and they must be understood for what they are. They are ancestor figures. They are the faces of the dead turned toward the living, watching over the fields and the families and the daily life of the clans that raised them. Their backs are to the sea, not because the sea is forgotten, but because the sea is behind them. The sea is where they came from, and they have arrived, and what matters now is here, the land, the people, the ongoing work of civilization. Each Moai is a specific ancestor, commemorated in stone so that the dead do not become absent, so that the knowledge and the authority and the accumulated wisdom of the lineage remain present in the landscape, available to the living, a continuous consultation between generations. There is nothing inexplicable about them. There is nothing mysterious. They mean something specific to the people who made them, and that meaning is not lost. It is simply not always granted the dignity of being explained on its own terms. The quarry at Ranaraku is the mouth from which these ancestors emerge. The soft volcanic tuff of the crater wall yields to stone tools with a patience that is itself a form of devotion. The Moai are carved lying on their backs in the crater face, then walked upright. Walked, the oral tradition insists. Walked across the landscape by the power of the ancestors themselves, by teams of people with ropes and leverage and a specific knowledge of how to move a stone giant without breaking it. The largest Moai ever raised stands 30 feet tall and weighs more than 80 tons. The engineering required to move it from the quarry to its Ahu, across miles of uneven volcanic terrain, without wheels, without draft animals, without any of the mechanical advantages that European engineers would consider prerequisites for such a task. This engineering is not brute force, it is intelligence. It is the application of principles worked out over generations of practice, refined and transmitted through the same channels that carried the navigational knowledge of Hotu Matu'a, living memory, embodied skill, the accumulated inheritance of a people paying close attention to the world they inhabit. By the time Rugavine's ships appear on the horizon in 1722, the Rapa Nui have been building their civilization for at least 500 years, and possibly much longer. The Moai stand in their hundreds along the coast. The Ahu anchor the landscape of every clan territory. The garden terraces feed a population of several thousand people on 63 square miles of volcanic rock, 2,000 miles from the nearest human habitation. And there are the two hunger. They are the priests and the scholars, the keepers of the island's intellectual inheritance. In their hands and in their memory, they hold the Rongorongo tablets, wooden boards carved with a system of glyphs that constitute one of only a handful of independent writing systems ever invented in the entire history of the human species. Not borrowed, not derived, not introduced from outside. Invented here on this island by these people in the most isolated inhabited place on Earth. The Tohunga read the tablets in a specialized form of chant, running their fingers along the lines of glyphs in alternating directions. A practice called boustrophedon, the same technique used in some early forms of Greek writing that suggests a sophistication of conception that has no parallel in the Pacific. What the tablets contain: history, ritual, astronomical knowledge, genealogy, the deep memory of a civilization, is carried in the living minds of the Tohunga, passed from teacher to student across generations. irreplaceable and alive. The audience does not yet know what is coming for them, but the knowledge sits at the edge of the story now, quiet as a stone placed at the side of a path. They are, by any honest measure, one of the most remarkable civilizations the world has ever produced. A people who crossed the most unforgiving ocean on Earth, guided by the stars and the swells and the flight of birds, who built a science of their small and finite land, who raised stone ancestors to watch over the living, and who wrote, in a script no one else on Earth had yet conceived, the story of who they were and how they came to be here, and the world is about to destroy them for it. Stand at the quarry of Rano Raraku, and the scale of what the Rapa Nui attempted becomes almost hallucinatory. The volcano rises from the southeastern corner of the island like a broken crown, its inner slopes terraced by centuries of human intention. And everywhere you look, there are faces. Faces emerging from the rock, faces tilted at strange angles toward the sky. Faces half-born, still wearing the mountain like a call, their features distinct and purposeful, and somehow patient, as though they are simply waiting for someone to finish the work. Nearly 400 moi remain here. Some are complete, standing free, ready to be walked to their platforms along the island's coast. Some are still attached to the rock face by a thin spine of uncut tuff, their forms fully realized on 3 sides and open to the air, needing only the final severance to become themselves entirely. The quarry is not a ruin. It is a workshop, frozen at the moment of its greatest productivity, and the silence that fills it now is not the silence of abandonment. It is the silence of interruption. The largest figure ever attempted lies on the quarry floor, 30 feet long, 60 tons of volcanic tuff, still cradled in the earth that made it. Its nose is carved, its chin is defined, its ears carry the elongated lobes of a person of status. Every detail can be completed while the figure remains attached to the bedrock, has been completed, and then the work stops. Not gradually, not because the quarryman grew tired or the project was reconsidered. The tools are there. The intention is there. The figure is almost done. And then it is not done, and it will never be done. And the particular grief of that, the grief of something almost finished, something that came so close to becoming what it was meant to be, is one of the heaviest griefs there is. It is the grief of the interrupted sentence, the grief of the letter never sent, the grief of a people who had more to say and were not given the time to say it. Sit with that image for a moment. Let the silence of this quarry be what it actually is. Now consider what it means that this quarry exists at all. Consider what it means that a society on a volcanic island, 63 square miles in area, with no metal tools, no wheeled vehicles, no draft animals of any kind, sustained a multi-generational project of monumental sculpture that produced, in total, nearly 1,000 figures, the smallest the height of a man, the largest 30 feet of carved stone, and moved them, somehow, across miles of terrain to platforms along the coast. The engineering of this achievement is staggering by any measure. The moai are not small. The smallest transported figure weighs several tons. The average stands 13 feet tall and weighs 14 tons. They are moved upright, some researchers now believe, walked to their platforms in a controlled rocking motion, guided by ropes, requiring the coordinated effort of dozens of people working in practiced unison. The platforms they stand on, the ahu, are themselves feats of dry stone masonry, massive, precisely fitted, oriented with astronomical care toward the rising and setting points of significant stars. This is not the signature of a civilization consuming itself in competitive frenzy. This is the signature of a civilization functioning at full capacity. You do not build this way unless you have surplus food, surplus labor, surplus time, surplus social cohesion. You do not sustain a project across generations unless the generations agree that the project matters. The Moai are not evidence of excess. They are evidence of abundance. They are evidence of a people organized enough, fed enough, spiritually serious enough to commit their best energy across centuries to the veneration of their ancestors. Every figure that stands on its ahu is a chief, a founder, a lineage keeper, raised to watch over the living descendants of the people who built it. The eyes, once inlaid with white coral and red scoria, look inland. They do not watch the sea. They watch the fields, the gardens, the houses, the children. They are guardians. They are declarations. They are proof of a cosmology sophisticated enough to understand that the dead do not leave. They remain. And they remain powerful. And they can be honored in stone. For decades, this quarry has been read as a warning, the story told about Reino Raraku, told in textbooks, in popular science articles, in the confident prose of writers who mistake a compelling narrative for a true one, is a story about a civilization that destroyed itself in the pursuit of monuments it could not afford, a story about chiefs competing for prestige, until the forests were stripped bare and the soil eroded into the sea and the fish stopped running and the people, facing starvation, toppled the very statues their ambition had raised. It is a story that feels satisfying in the way that parables feel satisfying. It has the clean arc of a morality tale. It points a finger at human nature itself, at greed, at vanity, at the inability to see the cliff approaching until you are already over the edge. It is also, in its most important particulars, wrong. The ecological stress was real. The writer who tells you otherwise is not serving the truth. The native palm forest that once covered much of Rapa Nui is gone, and the loss of that forest mattered. It changed the hydrology of the island, reduced the fertility of the soil, made certain kinds of canoe building and fishing more difficult. This is not in dispute. What is in dispute is who bears responsibility for it, and the evidence, examined honestly, points in a direction the parable does not want to go. The Polynesian rat arrives with the first settlers. It arrives because it always arrives. It travels in the hulls of canoes. It feeds on stored food, and it breeds with the relentless efficiency of a creature that has never met a predator it cannot outlast. On Rapa Nui, the rat finds something extraordinary, a palm forest full of seeds and no natural enemies. The palm seeds are large and nutritious and defenseless, and the rats eat them, not all of them, not immediately, but across decades and then centuries. The rat consumes the seed stock of the native palm at a rate the forest cannot absorb. The palms that stand continue to stand for a long time. They are long-lived trees, and their death is slow. But the regeneration stops. The seedlings do not survive, and when the standing trees eventually fall, there are no young trees to replace them, because the rats have been eating the future of the forest for generations. The islanders are not oblivious to this. They are not passive. They are farmers of extraordinary ingenuity on a small and volcanic and wind-scoured island, and they develop in response to their conditions a technique that modern agricultural scientists study with genuine admiration. They call it lithic mulching. They break volcanic rock. The same tuff they quarry for their muai into fragments and work it into the soil of their garden plots. The broken rock retains moisture. It releases minerals. It creates a microclimate at the soil surface that protects against the wind and the sun. It is a solution to the problem of farming marginal land that is so sophisticated, so carefully calibrated to the specific geology and climate of this specific island, that it represents not the knowledge of a civilization in crisis, but the knowledge of a civilization in full command of its environment. The Rapa Nui do not watch their land fail and despair. They adapt, they engineer, they find a way. This matters. It matters because the story that replaces their ingenuity with their folly is a story that serves a particular purpose. It allows the people who will come after, the explorers, the slavers, the colonial administrators, the sheep farmers, to arrive at an island already framed as the scene of a self-inflicted catastrophe, and to position themselves not as destroyers, but as inheritors of ruins. If the Rapa Nui destroyed themselves, then what follows is not a crime. It is a footnote, but before that story can be written, there is something else to understand about this civilization. Something that must be named with the reverence it deserves and with the foreboding it carries. The Tuhunga are the priests and scholars of Rapa Nui, the keepers of a knowledge so specialized and so ancient that it is held by only a small number of people at any given time, passed from master to apprentice across generations with the care that any civilization brings to its most precious inheritance. They maintain the genealogies, the long chains of names and relationships that connect the living to the founding ancestors and give each clan its identity and its land rights. They maintain the astronomical knowledge, the careful observation of stars and solstices, and the movements of the sky that governs the planting calendar, the fishing calendar, the ritual calendar of the island's year. They maintain the navigational tradition, the deep knowledge of swells and currents and bird behavior that makes voyaging possible across open ocean, and they maintain the tablets. The Rongorongo tablets are wooden boards, some small enough to hold in one hand, some larger. Their surface is covered on every face with lines of carved glyphs, tiny, intricate, dense with meaning. The glyphs represent animals and plants and human figures and abstract forms, arranged in a system of alternating orientation, so that each line is read and then the tablet is rotated and the next line read in the opposite direction, a technique called reverse boustrophedon that requires the reader to hold the entire system in the body as well as the mind. There are somewhere between 20 and 25 known tablets. No one knows how many once existed. The ones that survive carry names: the Santiago tablet, the Tahua, the Mamari, the Katie, names given by the outsiders who eventually collect them, because the people who made them and named them and read them are mostly gone by the time the tablets reach European hands. What the tablets contain, no one outside the Tuhunga has ever known. What they are believed to contain, based on the fragments of testimony that survive from the last people who had any knowledge of the tradition, is everything: history, genealogy, ritual, astronomy, navigation. Navigation, the accumulated knowledge of a civilization that has been accumulating knowledge for centuries on the most isolated piece of inhabited land on Earth. The Rongorongo script is one of only a handful of writing systems ever invented independently by human beings anywhere in the history of the world. Mesopotamia, Egypt, China, Mesoamerica, and here, in the middle of the Pacific Ocean, on an island 63 square miles of volcanic rock, a people invents writing because they have something to say and they intend to say it in a form that will outlast the breath that carries it. No one has read Rongorongo since the 1860s. The knowledge encoded in those tablets, all of it, every genealogy, every star chart, every navigational instruction, every history, is locked inside a script that no living person can open. It is not lost in the way that things are carelessly misplaced. It is locked in the way that a room is locked, when everyone who ever held the key has been taken away. That taking has not yet happened as we stand in this quarry. The Tahunga still hold the tablets. The knowledge still breathes inside the tradition. The Mu'ai still stand on their platforms along the coast, their coral eyes open to the interior of the island, watching over the living with the patient authority of the honored dead. The last Mu'ai, raised before contact, stands on its platform above the southern coast, its face warmed by 5 centuries of Pacific wind, its meaning intact for anyone willing to read it honestly. It is not a warning about hubris. It is a declaration of presence. We were here, we built this, we intended to last. The tragedy is not that they failed to last. The tragedy is what was done to them. There is no monument to the first Rapa Nui child, who died of a disease that had no name in any language spoken on the island. There is no record of the first fever, the first rash spreading across skin that had no ancestral memory of smallpox or measles, or the common cold weaponized by continental exposure into something lethal. There is only the silence that follows in the archaeological and demographic record. A silence that speaks, if you know how to listen, of a catastrophe so total it nearly erases the people who experienced it. This is how the invisible army works. It does not announce itself. It carries no flag. It is not recorded in any ship's manifest, because no captain in 1722 understands what he is transporting across the Pacific alongside his trade goods and his theological certainties and his maps full of hopeful coastlines. Jacob Roggeveen does not know that his crew carries within their bodies a biological inheritance so vast and so lethal that it will, in the coming decades, accomplish what no military campaign, no act of deliberate violence could accomplish alone. He does not know this. That is the first and perhaps the most important thing to understand about what is coming. The weapon is invisible even to the people who wield it. But ignorance is not innocence, and the absence of intention does not soften the arithmetic of what follows. To understand what happens to Rapa Nui after 1722, you must first understand what a virgin soil epidemic is. What it means, in biological terms, to be a population that has never encountered a pathogen. When a disease moves through a community with prior exposure, it finds pockets of resistance. Immune systems that have fought this enemy before recognize it. The very old and the very young bear the heaviest losses, but the community's core survives. It has been through this before. Its bodies remember. The Rapa Nui have not been through this before. Its bodies remember. The Rapa Nui have not been through this before. No one on this island has. For centuries, perhaps for 1,000 years, they have lived in a biological world of their own, their immune systems shaped by the pathogens that exist in their particular corner of the Pacific and no others. They are not weak. They are not fragile. They are, in every meaningful sense, perfectly adapted to the world they inhabit. But the world is about to change, and their bodies will have no answer for what is crossing into them. When Roggeveen's 3 ships drop anchor on Easter Sunday, 1722, the Rapa Nui do what their nature and their culture instructs them to do. They paddle out in canoes. They approach with the confidence of a people who have no reason to fear the sea or anything that arrives upon it. Some of them climb aboard the Dutch vessels. There are exchanges, objects passed between hands, the ordinary human pantomime of first contact between peoples who share no language. There are handshakes, perhaps. There is proximity. There is proximity. There's the simple, devastating fact of two populations breathing the same salt air above the same deck. This is the handshake that kills thousands. The incubation period for smallpox is between 7 and 17 days. A man who feels perfectly healthy on the morning he shakes a Rapa Nui elder's hand may be carrying within him a viral load sufficient to begin a chain of transmission that will not exhaust itself for months. The elder returns to shore. He returns to his family, his clan, his village. He attends the ceremonies and the gatherings that are the connective tissue of Rapa Nui's social life. He has no concept of quarantine because quarantine is a response to a category of threat that does not exist in his world. No such threat has ever existed in his world. He does what human beings do. He lives among his people. And then the fever comes. What follows does not happen all at once. This is crucial to understand because the gradual nature of the catastrophe is part of what makes it so difficult to see clearly from the outside. The population does not vanish overnight. It diminishes. It weakens. It loses in each successive wave of illness, not just bodies, but knowledge. The accumulated expertise of individuals who will not be replaced, whose understanding of agriculture and astronomy and navigation and ritual exists nowhere but in their minds and dies with them. A society can absorb the loss of some of its members and continue. It has done this throughout its history, through drought, through fishing seasons that fail, through the ordinary attrition of lives lived close to the edge of a finite world. But a virgin soil epidemic does not take some. It takes everyone it can reach, and it can reach nearly everyone. And it does not wait for the community to recover before the next wave arrives. Because the ships keep coming, Roggeveen's visit in 1722 is the first wave. It is followed by years of silence, years during which the disease moves through the population at its own pace, in its own time, leaving no written record and no archaeological signature that a later century can easily read. And then, in 1770, the Spanish arrive. González de Hidalgo commands 2 ships and a set of imperial ambitions, and he brings ashore a party of officers and priests and, invisibly, whatever biological passengers are living in the bodies of his crew. The Spanish expedition carries with it a document. It is a formal declaration of annexation, written in the legal language of the Spanish crown, asserting sovereignty over this island and everything upon it. The officers bring several Rapa Nui men ashore and ask them to sign it. The Rapa Nui sign. They do not sign with an X, as an illiterate person might. They do not make a random mark. They sign with symbols. Careful, deliberate symbols that belong to a writing system of their own. A system called Rongorongo, one of only a handful of independent writing systems ever invented by human beings anywhere in the history of the world. They are, in this moment, illiterate people signing a document they cannot read, in a legal tradition they have no knowledge of, authorizing a transfer of sovereignty they have no framework to imagine. They bring to the act of signing everything they have, their own intelligence, their own script, their own understanding of what marks on a surface can mean. It is not enough. It cannot be enough. The document means what the Spanish say it means, and what the Spanish say it means is that this island now belongs to the Crown of Spain, and the people who have lived here for 1,000 years are subjects of a king whose name they do not know. Let that moment stand without commentary. Its full weight will be felt later, by the time Captain James Cook arrives in 1774 just 4 years after the Spanish, just 52 years after Roggeveen. He finds something that troubles him. The island is populated, yes. The people come out to meet his ships, as they have met every ship, because this is what they do, because curiosity and openness are built into the culture of a people who have always understood that the world is large and arrives from unexpected directions. But Cook is a careful observer, and what he observes disturbs him. The population seems reduced. The people seem, in some way he cannot quite articulate, diminished. And the Mue, those great stone ancestors that Roggeveen described standing upright on their platforms, their eyes turned inland to watch over the living. Some of them are no longer standing. Some have been toppled. Some platforms show signs of disturbance, of disruption, of something having gone wrong in the relationship between the figures and the people who raised them. Cook and his men look at the fallen Moai and they draw a conclusion. The conclusion feels reasonable to them. It feels, in fact, like the only conclusion available to men of their era and their assumptions. A monument falls, they reason, because the people who built it have turned away from it. A platform is disturbed because the society that constructed it has come apart. The Rapa Nui, Cook's contemporaries will suggest, have collapsed. They have overreached. They have consumed their resources, exhausted their island, and descended into the kind of internecine violence that brings monuments down. This conclusion is wrong. It is wrong in every particular, but it will prove remarkably durable. What Cook is actually seeing in 1774 is the physical evidence of a society under biological siege. The Moai do not fall because the Rapa Nui have abandoned them. The Moai fall because the people who would maintain them are dying. The platforms are disturbed not by civil war, but by communities so reduced in number, so stricken by successive waves of illness, so depleted of the specific individuals who held the knowledge of ritual maintenance that the ordinary work of tending the ancestors cannot continue. A platform requires hands to care for it. A Moai requires a community to keep it standing in the fullest sense, not just physically upright, but spiritually present, tended, remembered, given offerings, incorporated into the living ceremonial life of a people. When the people diminish, the ceremonies diminish with them. When the ceremonies diminish, the platforms fall quiet. And when the platforms fall quiet long enough, the physical structures begin to reflect the silence. This is not collapse. This is mourning made visible in stone. But Cook does not see mourning. Cook sees failure, and the interpretation he and his contemporaries impose on what they observe will echo forward through centuries, will become the foundational myth of Easter Island as cautionary tale, will be repeated in textbooks and documentaries and popular science books as though it were established fact rather than a colonial misreading so profound it constitutes its own kind of violence. The Invisible Army has already done its work by 1774. It has moved through the population in waves that no one on the island has the medical knowledge to understand or resist. It has taken elders and children and the people in between. It has taken farmers who understood the microecology of their garden plots, navigators who held in their heads the star paths to islands thousands of miles away, priests who could read the Rongorongo tablets, and mothers who would have taught their children what the world means and how to live in it with dignity. It has taken all of this, and it has left behind a community that is diminished but not defeated, reduced but not broken, still paddling out to meet the ships, still bringing their curiosity and their openness to every new encounter, still doing what human beings do when they have not yet been given sufficient reason to stop. They do not know what is killing them. This is perhaps the most devastating fact of all. They have no germ theory, no microscope, no framework within which the connection between a Dutch sailor's handshake in 1722 and a child's fever in 1725 can be made visible and understood. The deaths come, and they are mourned, and the community does what communities do. It adapts, it contracts, it finds ways to continue, but it cannot adapt to what it cannot see. It cannot defend against an enemy that has no face, no weapon, no declaration of war. The invisible army asks for no surrender. It simply advances, and Cook stands on the deck of his ship and looks at the fallen Moai and writes in his journal that the islanders appear to have abandoned their great works, and he sails away, and the interpretation sails with him, and it will outlast him by centuries. The Moai do not fall because the Rapa Nui abandoned them. They fall because the people who would have maintained them are dying, and the men who record the falling are the same men whose arrival set the dying in motion, looking directly at the evidence of what they have brought to these shores and seeing, in its place, a lesson about the folly of the people who were here before them. The silence that follows is not the silence of a civilization that has destroyed itself. It is the silence of a civilization that is being destroyed, slowly, invisibly, by forces it has no name for and no defense against, on an island so remote that no help is coming, because no one who could help understands what is happening, and no one who understands what is happening has the power to stop it. The invisible army does not rest. It does not negotiate. It does not distinguish between the child who first learned to read the Rongorongo tablets last season and the old man who has been reading them for 60 years. It takes what it finds, and what it finds, here at the farthest edge of the inhabited world, is a people who have survived everything the ocean could throw at them for 1,000 years, and who have, in that survival, never once imagined that the thing that would finally threaten them would arrive not as a storm or a drought or a rival fleet, but as something carried invisibly in the body of a man who means them no harm and does not know what he is carrying and will be gone before the first fever breaks. The ships keep coming. That is the fact that must be held in the mind before any other. Not the arrival of one ship, not the singular catastrophe of first contact, but the rhythm of what follows. The way the horizon becomes, in the decades after Roggeveen, a place that delivers threat with the regularity of weather. By the 1770s, Rapa Nui is on the map of European exploration, which means it is on the map of European exploitation. And the distinction between those two things is one that only the explorers have the luxury of making. The Spanish come in 1770. The English come in 1770. The English come in 1770. The French are already planning their expedition. The Americans will follow. Each vessel that drops anchor in the waters off this island carries the accumulated biological arsenal of the old world. The smallpox, the measles, the typhus, the influenza, the common cold turned lethal by the absolute absence of any prior exposure, and each vessel deposits some portion of that arsenal on a shore whose people have no immunity, no medicine, no framework of understanding within which to place what is happening to them, and no power whatsoever to make it stop. The Spanish arrive on March 15, 1770, under the command of Felipe González de Hadé, 2 ships sailing out of Callao, Peru, with instructions to chart the eastern Pacific and to claim whatever they find for the Spanish crown. They spend 6 days on the island, which is 6 days longer than Roggeveen managed, and they are thorough in a way that Roggeveen was not. They survey the coastline. They make contact with the population, which they judge to be several thousand people, healthy and capable and astonished by the strangers who have come among them. They distribute gifts. They observe the Matu'a with the mixture of wonder and incomprehension that will characterize every European account of these figures for the next 2 centuries. And before they leave, they do something that will echo far into the future. They draw up a document of annexation, a formal legal instrument by which the island and all its people and all its resources are declared the sovereign possession of the King of Spain, and they present this document to the island's chiefs for their signatures. The chiefs sign. They do not sign with Spanish letters. They do not sign with their names transliterated into the Roman alphabet. They sign in Rongorongo, the island's own written language, the one that the priests and scholars have maintained and transmitted across generations, the one that no European in that harbor or anywhere else on earth can read. What those symbols mean, what the chiefs understand themselves to be agreeing to, whether the concept of territorial sovereignty in the European legal sense has any translation in the political vocabulary of Rapa Nui. These are questions the Spanish do not ask. They have their signatures, they roll up their document, they sail away. What the chiefs have signed, in the script of their own civilization, in the language of their own intellectual tradition, is the first legal fiction of their dispossession. They have been made to authorize, in their own hand, a claim they did not understand on behalf of a king they had never heard of, over a land that their ancestors shaped with their own bodies, across 5 centuries of patient and brilliant habitation. The document is real, the consent is not, and the island does not yet know what has been done to it, because the consequences of that document will not arrive for another century. And by the time they do, the people who could read those Rongorongo signatures will be dead. James Cook arrives 4 years later, in March of 1774, and he brings with him the observational discipline that has made him the most precise cartographer of the Pacific world. He is also, by this point in his voyages, deeply experienced in the encounter between European ships and Pacific Island peoples, and what he records about Rapa Nui is shot through with a sadness he does not quite understand the source of. The population, he writes, seems diminished. The people he meets appear less numerous, less vigorous than the Spanish accounts had suggested. The island seems in some way reduced, though he cannot say precisely how or why. He spends 4 days. He observes the Matu'a, some of which are already beginning to show signs of neglect. The ceremonial platforms no longer maintained with the same precision that the stonework itself suggests they once were. He does not connect this diminishment to the visits that preceded his own. He does not consider that the Spanish ships carried passengers that did not appear on any manifest and did not disembark with the landing party, and were not visible to any eye, but were nonetheless present and are still, even now, working their way through a population that has nothing with which to fight them. This is the trap that closes around the Rapa Nui in this period, and it closes from every direction at once. When they resist the Europeans who come ashore, and they do resist, they steal iron tools and fishhooks and whatever metal objects they can reach, because metal is a technology they do not have and whose utility is immediately apparent. They are written down as treacherous, thieves, savages whose natural dishonesty must be managed by force. When they accommodate, when they trade and welcome and attempt the diplomacy of a people who have always understood that the stranger at your shore is better received than fought, they are written down as diminished, passive, a people who have lost the vitality that must once have built these enormous stones. There is no behavior available to them that will be recorded sympathetically, because the men doing the recording have already decided what they are looking at. They are looking at a primitive people on a remote island, and everything they see is filtered through that prior conclusion. The resistance confirms it. The accommodation confirms it. The moai, which are the most extraordinary architectural achievement in the Pacific world, become evidence not of genius but of mystery. How could these people, these diminished, passive, treacherous people, have built such things? The question contains its own answer, and the answer is always wrong. What no one in those ships' logs is recording is what is happening to the land. The rats came with the first canoes 1,000 years ago, and they have been part of the island's ecology ever since. Destructive, yes, a pressure on the palm forests that were once more extensive, but a pressure that the Rapa Nui have learned to manage and to absorb. What the European ships bring is different in kind. They bring cats, which establish feral populations that move through the nesting colonies of seabirds with systematic efficiency. They bring goats and pigs, which are released or escape and begin to work their way across an island whose vegetation has no evolutionary history with large grazing mammals, and therefore no defenses against them. They trample the lithic mulch gardens, those extraordinary engineered plots where the Rapa Nui have placed volcanic rock fragments in careful arrangements to retain moisture and moderate soil temperature and coax productivity from a substrate that has no business growing sweet potato at this latitude. They eat the taro. They root up the yam plots. They strip the ground cover from slopes that will now erode with the next rain, and the next, and the one after that. These gardens are not primitive. They are not the desperate scratching of a people at the edge of survival. They are the product of centuries of agricultural knowledge, carefully accumulated and precisely applied. A technology of cultivation as sophisticated in its own terms as anything the Europeans who are destroying it have developed in their own temperate latitudes. The people who maintain these gardens understand their island's hydrology, its soil chemistry, its seasonal variation, its carrying capacity. They have been feeding themselves on 63 square miles of volcanic rock in the middle of the Pacific Ocean for 500 years, and the system they have built to do that is a marvel of applied intelligence. The goats do not know this. The goats eat. And the people who might repair the damage, who might reinforce the garden walls and replant the cleared plots and adapt the system to the new pressures being placed upon it, are getting sick. They are dying in numbers that the community's social structures are not designed to absorb, because no social structure is designed to absorb this, because nothing in the history of human civilization has prepared any people for the particular catastrophe of first contact with old-world disease. The knowledge of how to maintain the gardens is held by people who are dying. The knowledge of how to read the stars for navigation is held by people who are dying. The knowledge of how to read Rongo is held by people who are dying. Knowledge is not written in books here. It is written in people, and the people are being erased. The moai begin to fall, not all at once, not in some dramatic convulsion of civil war, though the European accounts will eventually construct that narrative because it is more satisfying and more useful than the truth. They fall the way things fall when there is no one left to care for them. Slowly, one by one, the Ahu platforms crumbling at their bases, the great stone figures tilting and then toppling forward onto the ground they were raised to watch over. Each fallen moai is a monument not to the collapse of the civilization that built it, but to the absence of the people who would have kept it standing. The stones do not fall because the Rapa Nui have destroyed themselves. They fall because the Rapa Nui are being destroyed, and the difference between those two sentences is the difference between a verdict and a crime. Jean-François de Galaup, the Comte de la Péruche, arrives in 1786 with 2 frigates and the explicit mission of scientific observation. He is, by the standards of his age and his profession, a humane man. He has read Cook. He has read the Spanish accounts. He approaches the island with genuine curiosity and what he believes to be genuine respect, and he spends 10 hours on shore. 10 hours. Less time than it takes to cross the island on foot at a leisurely pace, and in that time he distributes gifts. He makes observations. He directs his naturalists to record the flora and the fauna and the state of the agricultural plots, and he writes in his Jiao Mal with what he takes to be compassion about the people he encounters. He notes their reduced numbers. He notes the fallen Moai. He notes what appears to him to be a society in decline, its great works abandoned, its population sparse and somehow melancholy. He attributes this to causes he cannot quite identify. He wonders, in the manner of an educated 18th century Frenchman, whether the island's resources were always unequal to the ambitions of the people who lived here. He does not wonder whether the 3 European expeditions that preceded his own might have contributed to what he is observing. He does not calculate the epidemiological arithmetic of 4 ships in 16 years landing on a population with no immunity to anything those ships carry. He does not consider that his own visit, his own crew, his own biological passengers are at this very moment adding their weight to an accumulating catastrophe that will continue long after his frigates have disappeared over the horizon. He writes with compassion. He sails away. The island is left again with its dead and its dying, with its fallen stones and its failing gardens, with its people who are fewer than they were last year and will be fewer still by next year, with its knowledge that is bleeding away with every elder who does not recover from the fever that came with the last ship or the one before that. The Rapa Nui have no word for what is happening to them, because no word for this has ever needed to exist. They are living inside a catastrophe that has no name in any language, that will not be understood for another century, that will eventually be misnamed and misassigned and turned into a story about their own failures. Far to the east, in the ports of Callao and Valparaiso, in the counting houses of Lima and the labor markets of the Peruvian coast, a trade is growing. It has been working its way across the Pacific for decades now. This trade in human bodies from islands too small and too remote to defend themselves, islands with no navy and no diplomatic representation, and no one in any capital city who knows their name or cares to learn it. The trade moves from island to island like a current, following the logic of isolation and vulnerability, and it is looking for exactly the kind of place that Rapa Nui has become, a place far from everything, known to no one who matters, full of people who have already been so reduced by disease and disruption that they cannot muster the numbers to resist what is coming. Lepérez does not know this. He is a scientist and an explorer and a man of the Enlightenment, and he believes that the world is becoming more rational, more humane, more capable of recognizing the dignity of all peoples. He sails north and then west and eventually into the Pacific's vast, indifferent dark, and the island he has left behind settles back into its silence, counting what it has left, tending what it can still tend, watching the horizon with the particular attention of a people who have learned, across 60 years of contact, that what comes from the sea does not come to help them. The horizon is quiet now. It will not stay that way. In December of 1862, 8 ships appear on the horizon at once. Not one, not 2 arriving in sequence. the way a trading vessel might follow the wake of a scout. 8. Simultaneously. A formation, and anyone standing on the volcanic shore of Rapa Nui who understands anything about the sea understands immediately that 8 ships do not arrive together by accident. 8 ships arriving together means someone, somewhere, has made a plan. This is not exploration. Exploration is a single vessel feeling its way toward an unknown coast, its crew nervous, its captain consulting charts that end in speculation. This is logistics. This is the application of organizational capacity to a problem that has been identified, studied and solved at a desk somewhere in Lima, in a counting house where men in good coats calculate the cost of labor against the price of fertilizer and arrive at a number that requires human bodies to make it real. The guano trade is, by 1862, one of the most profitable enterprises in the Pacific world. On the Chincha Islands, 3 rocky outcroppings rising from the cold waters off the Peruvian coast, seabirds have been depositing their excrement for centuries, building deposits that reach, in some places, 150 feet deep. This material, raw, reeking, ancient, is nitrogen in concentrated form. It is what the exhausted fields of Europe and North America need to continue producing the grain that feeds expanding populations on continents that have already pushed their soil past the point of natural recovery. The demand is insatiable. The Chincha Islands are being carved down, shovel by shovel, into the sea, and the men doing the carving are dying faster than they can be replaced. The conditions in the guano pits are not survivable over any meaningful duration. The ammonia is so concentrated that it destroys the lungs. The sun on the bare rock is unrelenting. The food is inadequate. The water is scarce. Workers die at a rate that the trade's operators have simply incorporated into their accounting, the way a factory might account for the replacement of worn machinery. What is needed continuously is a fresh supply of people who have no choice but to work until they cannot work anymore. The Peruvian operators have already drawn from the Chinese coolie trade, already drawn from other Pacific islands. By 1862, they are looking at Rapa Nui, small, isolated, already diminished, already unable to call on any outside power for protection, and they are making their calculations. 8 ships. December. The timing is deliberate. Christmas is approaching, and the raiders have understood something precise and predatory about the Rapa Nui relationship with Christian ritual. European missionaries have been moving through Polynesia for decades. The Rapa Nui have had enough contact with the iconography of Catholicism to recognize its symbols, to associate those symbols with the foreign men who sometimes arrive bearing gifts rather than weapons. Some of the raiders come ashore dressed as priests. They carry crosses. They arrange themselves in postures of ceremony, of offering, of welcome. They are performing a religion they may or may not believe in, using it as a mechanism of deception against people who have been taught to find in that religion something resembling goodwill. This is not incidental cruelty. Incidental cruelty is impulsive, unplanned, the product of a moment's violence. What happens on the shore of Rapa Nui in December of 1862 is deliberate cruelty, which is a different category of act entirely. Someone has thought about this. Someone has considered the specific vulnerability of the Rapa Nui relationship with Catholic imagery and decided to exploit it. Someone has calculated that the fastest way to get people onto ships without open warfare is to make the approach look like something it is not. The deception is not a detail. It is the method. It is the civilization being reached for through the door it thought was safe. The people who gather on the shore are not the most important mo for the community. They are among the most important. Kaimako, with the king, is taken. The Tohunga, the priests, the scholars, the men who carry the Rongo tradition in their minds and their hands are taken. The Ariki, the high-ranking clan leaders who hold the social architecture of the island together, are taken. This is not random seizure. The raiders understand, or have been told, that compliance follows leadership. If you take the king, the people who follow the king become easier to manage. If you take the people with the deepest knowledge and the highest standing, you take the civilization's capacity to organize resistance. You take its memory. You take its voice. Approximately 1,500 people are loaded onto the 8 ships, perhaps more. The accounting is imprecise because the people doing the accounting do not consider precision necessary when the subjects being counted are the people being taken. 1,500 represents something close to half of the island's surviving population. A population already reduced by a century of epidemic contact from the thousands Roggeveen encountered to the fragile remnant that now watches from the shore as the ships take their people and turn toward Peru. What happens on the Chincha Islands does not require elaborate description. The numbers provide it. Of the 1,500 or more people taken from Rapa Nui, approximately 100 survive long enough to be repatriated. 100 from 1,500. The arithmetic does not need assistance. It does not need metaphor or elaboration or the weight of carefully chosen adjectives. It simply needs to be stated and then allowed to sit in the silence it creates. 93% of the people taken from Rapa Nui die in the guano pits of Peru or on the ships to and from them within months of their arrival. The international response when it comes is a study in the distance between moral language and moral action. There is outcry. There are letters. There are diplomatic exchanges between Lima and the governments of Europe, between Catholic bishops and Peruvian officials, between men who find the slave trade distasteful in principle and men who find it profitable in practice. The Bishop of Tahiti, Florentin Etienne Jalson, Tipano Yossen, as he is known, is among the voices raised in genuine alarm. He is a man who has spent his life in the Pacific, who has learned its languages and its peoples with a particular devotion of someone who believes that these people matter, that their souls and their lives are of equivalent worth to any soul or life in Paris, or Lima, or Rome. He fights for repatriation. He is not wrong to fight. He's also not fast enough. The survivors, perhaps 100, perhaps slightly more, are eventually placed on ships and sent back toward Rapa Nui. They carry with them, in their blood and their breath, smallpox. The island they left had perhaps 600 people remaining. The island they return to has no immunity to what they carry. The disease moves through the 600 with the speed that only total immunological innocence allows. By the mid-1860s, the population of Rapa Nui has fallen to numbers that the word population can barely hold. 111 people on 63 square miles of volcanic rock that once sustained a civilization of thousands. 111 people survived to watch the sun rise over the Moai, their ancestors carved and raised and positioned with such care, such cosmological intention, such profound belief in the continuity of the community those figures were built to protect. Among the dead are the two hunger, not all of them. Not every single man who ever held a Rongorongo tablet or learned the chants that accompanied its reading. But enough. Enough that what remains is insufficient. The Rongorongo tradition is not a simple system. It is not a set of symbols whose meanings can be guessed at from context, decoded through comparison with neighboring scripts, reconstructed from the accumulated scholarship of a literate world. It is an independent invention, one of perhaps 5 or 6 writing systems ever created by human beings without reference to any other writing system anywhere on Earth. And its reading is an act that requires not just the symbols but the knowledge that lives alongside them, the oral tradition that gives the visual marks their meaning, the generational transmission of understanding from teacher T, O student, to hunger to apprentice, across the slow, patient centuries of a civilization that believed its knowledge would outlast its keepers. That belief is now proven wrong, not because the civilization failed to value what it knew, but because the people who held the knowledge have been taken to Peru and worked to death in the guano pits, or have died in the smallpox wave that the repatriation ships delivered as their final, unintended cargo. The tablets remain. 26 of them eventually will be identified and preserved in the museums of the world. In Washington, in London, in Santiago, in Leningrad, in Brussels, they are extraordinary objects, covered in a script that runs in alternating directions, each line inverted relative to the one above it, the reader turning the tablet as they go, a reading practice called boustrophedon that suggests a sophisticated and deliberate system of textual organization. The symbols are complex, consistent, clearly meaningful. They are also, as of the mid-1860s, completely unreadable. It is here that Alexander Salmon Jr. enters the story, though not yet in his full significance. He is already known in Pacific trading circles by this time, a man of mixed Tahitian and English heritage, who understands the architecture of isolation, who knows how to position himself between a diminished population and the outside world, who has the languages and the connections and the particular instinct for advantage that makes him, in the most precise sense of the word, a broker. He is watching. He is learning the geography of what remains. He will arrive on the island in the early 1870s, and when he does, he will find a community so reduced, so traumatized, so stripped of its intellectual inheritance that his position between them and the world will be essentially uncontestable. He does not need to take anything by force. The force has already been applied. He needs only to occupy the space it has created. But that is the next chapter of a story that has already been decided. Tepano Yalson, the bishop who fought for repatriation and succeeded only in delivering smallpox, does not stop. He cannot undo what has been done, but he can try to understand what has been lost. In the years following the catastrophe, a Rongorongo tablet comes into his possession, brought to him by a Rapa Nui man who has made his way to Tahiti. Yasin examines it with the attention of a scholar, traces its symbols, catalogues its forms. He finds a man named Matu'a, one of the Rapa Nui who has survived and reached Tahiti, who claims to be able to chant the tablets. Yasin sits with him. He listens. He records what Matu'a chants. What he discovers is that what Matu'a chants does not correspond to the symbols in any systematic pattern he can identify. Matu'a chants words, real words, Rapa Nui words. Rapa Nui words rave with meaning, but the relationship between those words and the specific symbols carved into the wood is not consistent in any way that suggests he is reading them. He may be remembering. He may be performing a ritual that once accompanied the reading, a chant that ran parallel to the written text rather than through it. He may be doing something that made complete sense to a Tuhonga in full possession of the tradition, and that now, severed from that tradition, is a fragment without its context, a melody without its score. Yasin records everything. He publishes his findings. He sends copies of the tablet's symbols to scholars around the world. No one can read them. No one has read them since. Yarsen sits in his study in Tahiti with the tablet before him and understands, with the particular clarity that comes to a man who has fought hard and arrived too late, what he is holding. He is holding the written record of a civilization. He is holding 5 centuries of accumulated thought, rendered in a script that an isolated people invented for themselves on the far edge of the world's largest ocean, because they had things worth writing down and the intelligence to create a system for doing so. He is holding something that the world's scholars will spend the next 150 years attempting to decipher, using every tool that linguistics and computational analysis and comparative mythology can bring to bear, and that will remain, as of this telling, unread. The tablets are not metaphor. They are not a symbol of lost knowledge deployed for rhetorical effect. They are the actual written record of an actual civilization, and they are silent because the people who could read them were taken to Peru in December of 1862 on 8 ships that appeared on the horizon simultaneously, were worked to death in the guano pits of the Chincha Islands, and were returned, those few who survived, in ships that carried smallpox as their unintended cargo. A civilization sophisticated enough to navigate the open Pacific and invent its own writing system is destroyed by contact with the civilization that will later study its ruins and call it a cautionary tale. The caution runs in the wrong direction. The lesson belongs not to the people who raised the moai and carved the tablets and planted their gardens in the volcanic soil of the most isolated place on Earth. The lesson belongs to the people who sent 8 ships in December and called it labor recruitment. The tablets sit in their museums, the symbols wait, and in his study in Tahiti, Terpano Yarsen closes the cover of his notebook, sets down his pen, and looks at the carved wood before him with the expression of a man who understands that he is looking at something the world has already, irrevocably, decided not to know. Alexander Salmon Jr. steps ashore on Rapa Nui in the early 1870s and understands, within hours, exactly what he is looking at. This is his gift. This has always been his gift. He has spent his entire life reading rooms in which one party holds all the power and the other party does not yet know it. And he has learned to position himself in the space between them, close enough to both to be useful to each, far enough from either to remain his own man. He is the son of a Tahitian chieftain and an English banker. He has grown up in the seam between worlds, fluent not only in the languages of the Pacific and the European commercial sphere, but in something harder to name and more valuable than either: the unspoken grammar of each. He knows how power moves. He knows how it disguises itself. He knows, with the particular clarity of a man who has watched this transaction conducted 100 times in 100 different harbors, exactly what is about to happen to this island and the people on it. What he is looking at is fewer than 200 people. Hold that number. Fewer than 200 people on an island that once held thousands, that once rang with the sound of stone being quarried and canoes being launched and the intricate social machinery of a civilization conducting its own life. Fewer than 200 people living in a state of trauma so profound that the word trauma is almost too clinical, too tidy to contain what it is trying to describe. These are the survivors of a biological assault that began the moment Jacob Roggeveen's ships dropped anchor in 1722. They are the survivors of 50 years of episodic contact with vessels that brought new disease every time they appeared on the horizon. They are the survivors of 1862, of the slave ships, of the 1,500 people seized and carried to the Guano Islands of Peru, of the smallpox that came back with the handful who were eventually returned. They have watched their priests and scholars die. They have watched the Rongorongo tablets, the written record of everything they knew. everything they were, one of only a handful of independent writing systems ever invented by human beings anywhere on this earth, become objects that no living person can read. They are a people stripped of their intellectual inheritance, stripped of their population, stripped of the social structures that gave meaning to the land around them. They are fewer than 200, and they are still here. And Alexander Salmon Jr. looks at them and sees an opportunity. This is not a simple villainy. Simple villainy would be easier to hold. What Salmon represents is something more uncomfortable, more instructive, more difficult to put down once you have picked it up. He is a gifted man. He is a clear-eyed man. He understands with genuine comprehension what he is looking at, and he decides not in ignorance, not in confusion, but with the full apparatus of his considerable intelligence engaged. To profit from it, he positions himself as the indispensable interpreter between the Rapa Nui and the accelerating traffic of ships, missionaries, traders, and colonial administrators who are now arriving at the island with intentions of increasing permanence. He speaks Polynesian to the islanders. He speaks commerce to the Europeans, and he manages what passes between these worlds with the practiced ease of a man who has been doing exactly this, in one form or another, his entire adult life, managing what passes between worlds, and ensuring that the management fees accrue to himself. The missionaries arrive. Father Hippolyta Roussel, of the Congregation of the Sacred Hearts, comes with the intention of saving souls, and he approaches that intention with the particular confidence of a man who has never seriously considered that the souls in question might not require saving. He is not a cruel man. He is something more dangerous than a cruel man. He is a certain man, and his certainty leads him, with the clean logic of the truly convinced, to gather up the Rongorongo tablets, those extraordinary objects, those carved wooden boards covered in the script that represents one of the most remarkable intellectual achievements in the history of isolated human civilization, and burn them. Pagan objects, artifacts of a world that is being replaced by a better one. He burns them. Salmon watches. This is the detail that must be held, that must not be released. Salmon watches Father Roussel burn the Rongorongo tablets, and then he turns around and brokers the sale of the surviving tablets to European collectors and museums. Take a moment with the full obscenity of this sequence. The tablets that survive the missionaries' fires are sold. They are sold to institutions that cannot read them, dispersed across the museums and private collections of a world that has no framework for understanding what it has acquired, sent to places where the people who might have contextualized them, the Rapa Nui themselves, the remaining inheritors of whatever fragmentary knowledge still clings to those symbols, will never go. These tablets will eventually be exhibited. They will be displayed behind glass in cities whose names the people who carved them never knew. They will be labeled, catalogued, photographed, studied by scholars who will spend careers attempting to decode a script that died with the people who held it. A script that might have been preserved if the people who held it had not been systematically killed. A script that is now undecipherable precisely because of actions that men like Salmon and Roussel either enabled or performed. And the institutions that acquire these tablets will, in time, use them as evidence of a civilization sophisticated enough to be worth studying, a civilization they will simultaneously, in their broader cultural conversation, blame for its own destruction. Salmon facilitates. This is his function, and he performs it with consistent competence. He facilitates the missionary presence, facilitating the transformation of whatever remains of Rapa Nui's ceremonial and intellectual life into the simplified vocabulary of Christian conversion. He facilitates the traders, ensuring that the island's remaining resources, what little remains after a century and a half of disruption flow outward toward markets that have no understanding of and no interest in what those resources cost to produce. He facilitates the colonial administrators, the men who arrive on behalf of Chile and France and various commercial interests, and need someone who can speak to the islanders, who can make the islanders understand what is being asked of them, who can smooth the transaction. He is indispensable. He has made himself indispensable. This is the architecture of his position, and he has built it with care. The year 1888 arrives with the flat inevitability of a door closing. Chile annexes Rapa Nui. The ceremony is what these ceremonies always are, a piece of theatre staged for the benefit of the annexing party, dubious in its legality, decisive in its consequence. A document is signed. A flag is raised. The island, which the Rapa Nui have inhabited and shaped and defended across 5 centuries of isolation and a century and a half of assault, becomes a territory of the Republic of Chile. The surviving Rapa Nui are not consulted in any meaningful sense. They are informed there is a difference, and everyone present understands the difference, and no one with the power to change the outcome chooses to exercise that power on behalf of the people who have the most to lose. What follows the annexation is swift and total. Chile leases the island, the entire island, every acre, every slope, every garden plot that the Rapa Nui maintained and cultivated and engineered across generations of patient agricultural knowledge, to a Scottish sheep farming company, the Williamson Balfour Company. The surviving Rapa Nui, who number now at their lowest recorded point 111 people, are confined to a single village, Hangaroa, a compound, in practice, a place where the remnant of a civilization is gathered and contained while the land their ancestors shaped is given over to other purposes. They are not permitted to move freely across the island that their ancestors navigated the open Pacific to find, that Hotu Matu'a brought his settlers and his seeds to across the most unforgiving ocean on the planet, that 5 centuries of human habitation and ingenuity and love have transformed into a home. That island is now a sheep pasture, and the people who made it are watched by foreigners from behind a fence. The sheep enter the story quietly. They should be noted quietly. They spread across the island's acres in the way that introduced species always spread when there is nothing left to resist them, steadily, completely, with the indifferent thoroughness of animals doing what animals do when the conditions are favorable. The Rapa Nui had maintained their island's soil. They had understood, across generations of living on a small and finite landmass far from any resupply, that the soil was everything, that the soil required tending, that the relationship between a people and their land was a relationship that demanded sustained attention and care. That knowledge, like the knowledge encoded in the Rongorongo tablets, is now dispersed and fragmented and largely inaccessible. And into the space left by that lost knowledge, the Williamson Balfour Company introduces its sheep. Within decades, the remaining vegetation will be gone. The soil that the Rapa Nui maintained for centuries will be stripped. The final ecological destruction of Rapa Nui will be accomplished not by the Rapa Nui, but by Scottish sheep and the company that owns them. A detail so precise in its irony that it would be almost elegant if it were not so devastating. This is the moment to return to Salmon, not to the specific man, who will eventually leave the island and take his facility for profitable positioning with him to other opportunities in other harbors, but to the function he represents. He is the man who managed the transition from living civilization to administered ruin. He is the man who spoke both languages and used that fluency to ensure that the transaction moved in one direction. He sold the artifacts of a culture he helped destroy to museums that would later use those artifacts to misinterpret the culture that made them. He stood in the seam between worlds and extracted value from the seam itself. He was not the disease, he was not the slave ship, he was not the missionary's fire, but he was the man who made all of those things manageable, navigable, profitable, the man who ensured that the machinery of erasure ran smoothly, that the people being erased did not create too much friction in the process of their own erasure, that the outside world received the island's remaining wealth in a form it could use. He is not unique. This is perhaps the most important thing to say about him. He is not a singular monster. He is a recognizable type, a recurring figure in the history of colonial encounter. The gifted intermediary who uses his position at the intersection of cultures not to protect the more vulnerable party, but to accelerate its dispossession. There are men like him in every story like this one. They are often charming. They are often genuinely intelligent. They often understand the situation with a clarity that the blunter instruments of colonial power do not possess. And they choose, with that clarity fully intact, to serve the interests of the party that is winning. 111 people in a single village. On an island their ancestors crossed the open Pacific to find, shaped with their own hands across 5 centuries, and defended with their lives against everything the outside world sent against them. 111 people, where there were once thousands, where there were people healthy and confident enough to paddle out in canoes to meet the ships of a Dutch explorer on Easter Sunday, 1722, and greet the horizon without fear. The population that Roggeveen encountered, several thousand people, a civilization at the height of its creative ambition, raising stone giants and tending engineered gardens and sailing the most unforgiving ocean on the planet, and arriving, improbably, triumphantly. Home has been reduced by 97% in 166 years. 97% in 166 years. This is not a parable. A parable requires a moral that the audience can apply to themselves, a lesson that reflects something back about human nature in general, a story in which the suffering of the victim serves the enlightenment of the readers. This is not that. This is a record of disease introduced by contact that the Rapa Nui did not seek and could not refuse, a record of slave ships and smallpox and the systematic destruction of a people's intellectual inheritance, a record of annexation and confinement and leased land and introduced sheep, a record of what one civilization does to another when it has the power and the indifference to do it, and when it can later reframe the wreckage as a cautionary tale about the civilization it wrecked. The Moai stand. Some of them stand again, raised in recent decades by the descendants of the 111, who are still here, who have always been still here, who refused across every generation of this long catastrophe to become the past tense that the world kept trying to assign them. They face inland. Their backs are to the sea. They are watching over the living, as they were always meant to watch, as they have always watched, through the epidemics and the slave raids and the missionaries' fires and the fences and the sheep, and the long, indifferent centuries of a world that looked at what they represented and chose to see only a warning about itself. The living are still here, and the record is still open. In 1992, a population ecologist named William Catton Jr. publishes an influential paper that uses Easter Island as the central metaphor for global resource depletion and civilizational overshoot. He is not the first. He will not be the last. By the end of the 20th century, Rapa Nui has become the most cited cautionary tale in the literature of environmental collapse. A parable repeated in textbooks, in TED Talks, in the speeches of heads of state, in the opening chapters of books about sustainability and the limits of growth. The parable travels easily because it is clean. It has a beginning, a middle, and an end. It has a lesson. The lesson is that we are all on Easter Island. We are all consuming ourselves. We are all, in our monument-building hubris, soaring off the branch on which we sit. The parable goes like this. A people isolated on a small island consumed their resources in a frenzy of monument building, cut down all their trees, destroyed the soil that fed them, and starved. They toppled their own statues in the chaos of societal breakdown. They turned on one another. They ate rats and, some versions whisper, each other. The civilization collapsed from within, a suicide in slow motion, and what the Dutch explorer Roggeveen found in 1722 was the dazed remnant of a people who had already done the worst to themselves. The Europeans, in this telling, arrive after the damage is done. They're almost beside the point, almost witnesses, almost innocent. The parable is a lie. It is not a misreading. It is not an oversimplification born of limited data, a forgivable error of an earlier and less rigorous scholarship. It is a fabrication assembled from assumption, from projection, from the kind of motivated reasoning that finds what it is looking for, because it has decided in advance what must be there, and it has consequences, real ones, moral ones, the kind that do not stay in the academy, but move through the culture and do damage in the world. The demolition of this lie begins in earnest on the ground, in the volcanic soil of Rapa Nui itself, in the patient and exacting work of two archaeologists named Terry Hunt and Carl Lipo. They arrive not with a thesis to confirm, but with tools to measure. Radiocarbon dating, sediment analysis, the close reading of what the Earth actually holds. And what the Earth holds does not match the parable, not even close. The deforestation of Rapa Nui is real. The palm forest that once covered the island is gone, and the loss of that forest is catastrophic. But Hunt and Lipo find that the timeline is wrong, and the agent is wrong, and the mechanism is wrong. The forest does not disappear in the centuries before European contact as a consequence of human overconsumption. The forest disappears more slowly, more unevenly, and with a cause that the parable never mentions: rats. Polynesian rats, Rattus exulans, arrive with the first settlers as they arrive everywhere the Polynesians sail, as stowaways, as livestock, as the inevitable biological companions of a seafaring people. On Rapa Nui, they find a paradise. They find a palm forest whose nuts they can eat and whose seedlings they can destroy before those seedlings ever become trees. The archaeological record shows rat-gnawed palm nuts in extraordinary abundance. What it does not show is the wholesale, frenzied human clear-cutting that the collapse narrative requires. The Rapa Nui are not innocent of all deforestation. They clear land for agriculture, as every agricultural people does. But they are not the primary agents of the forest's destruction. The rats run ahead of them, eating the future of the forest one seed at a time, and the parable blames the people. The population figures are wrong. The collapse narrative requires a population of 15 or 20,000 people, a number large enough to have consumed the island's resources to exhaustion, large enough to have crashed catastrophically to the few thousand Roggeveen encounters. Hunt and Lipo find no archaeological evidence for a population that large. The settlement patterns, the agricultural infrastructure, the carrying capacity of the land, None of it supports the inflated numbers the parable needs. The evidence points to a population that was always smaller, that lived within the island's means across centuries of careful stewardship, and that was not in demographic freefall when the first European ship appeared on the horizon. The Moai themselves, the monuments that the parable casts as the instruments of civilizational suicide, the stone obsession that ate the island's timber and the people's labor until nothing was left. The Moai are not what the parable says they are. The collapse narrative imagines them dragged horizontally across the island on wooden sledges, consuming forests of timber as rollers. Hundreds of trees felled for every statue moved. Hunt and Lipo demonstrate something else. The Moai walk, the evidence in the statue's own construction, their slightly forward center of gravity, the wear patterns on their bases, combined with experimental archaeology, shows that they can be moved upright, rocked from side to side by teams of people using ropes, traveling efficiently across the landscape without consuming a single tree. The monuments that were supposed to prove the civilization's suicidal irrationality turn out to be engineering achievements of extraordinary elegance. The accusation collapses under the weight of the evidence. The Moai were not the instruments of destruction. They were the products of a civilization that had solved the problem of moving them. Each of these corrections lands as more than a scholarly revision. Each one is the removal of a charge from an indictment that was never fair to begin with. The Rapa Nui have been on trial in the literature of environmental collapse for half a century, convicted of ecological self-murder on evidence that does not hold, sentenced to serve as a warning for a civilization that destroyed them and then needed someone else to blame. The archaeology is not just science. It is, in the most literal sense, posthumous justice, and yet the parable persists. It persists in the textbooks. It persists in the TED Talks. It persists in the policy papers and the speeches and the popular books whose authors have not read Hunt and Lipo, or have read them and found them inconvenient, or have decided that the emotional power of the story outweighs the obligation to get the story right. Why? The question demands an answer that is not merely academic. The collapse narrative is useful. That is the plainest way to say it. It is useful to the environmental movement, which needs cautionary tales, and finds in Easter Island a perfectly bounded, perfectly legible one. It is useful to those who wish to argue that indigenous peoples are as capable of ecological destruction as any industrialized nation, that the impulse to consume and destroy is universal, that no culture has a special claim to ecological wisdom, that we are all equally fallen. It is useful to a modern Western culture that is genuinely anxious about its own consumption, its own resource depletion, its own civilizational trajectory, and that finds in the Easter Island parable a mirror in which it can see its fears reflected without having to see its crimes. The mirror is the point. The mirror is why the parable survives the evidence against it. But here is what the mirror conceals. The Rapa Nui did not destroy their civilization was destroyed for them. The deforestation that the parable attributes to reckless monument building is better explained by introduced rats and, in its final and most devastating phase, by the 60,000 sheep the Williamson Balfour Company turns loose on the island after Chile annexes it in 1888. Those sheep do in a generation what 5 centuries of Rapa Nui stewardship had prevented. They strip the remaining vegetation from the volcanic soil. They compact the earth. They complete the ecological destruction that the slave raids and the epidemics began, and the collapse narrative then distributes the damage backward in time and attributes it to the people who were trying to survive it. The sheep are the colonial project's final ecological instrument, and the parable makes the Rapa Nui responsible for the damage the sheep cause. This is not an analytical error. Call it what it is. It is a moral one. It is the transfer of responsibility from perpetrators to victims, dressed in the language of ecology and systems theory and civilizational hubris. It takes the story of a people who were navigating the open Pacific when Europe was still hugging its coastlines, who were raising stone figures of extraordinary ambition and precision, who were farming engineered garden plots in volcanic rock and reading a written language that no other civilization on Earth had independently invented. It takes that story and turns it into a warning about human folly. It puts the crime on the victim. It calls the verdict a lesson. And then it teaches the lesson to children in classrooms on every continent as settled truth. The living community of Rapa Nui has rebuilt itself from 111 people. That number should stop every reader, every listener, every person who encounters it. 111. From a civilization of thousands, from a people who had sustained themselves for more than a millennium on the most isolated inhabited island on the planet, 111 people remain when the Chilean census of 1877 is taken. 111 people carry the entire inheritance, the genealogies, the agricultural knowledge, the navigational tradition, the oral history, the cultural memory of everything that came before. It is a miracle of human endurance that any of it survives at all. Today, the Rapa Nui number in the thousands again. They are still fighting for land, for autonomy, for the right to control what happens on the island their ancestors shaped. The Chilean administration that has governed them since annexation has not always governed well. The tourists who arrive by the hundreds of thousands each year come to see the Mu'ai, which is to say they come to see the products of a civilization whose destruction the modern world facilitated and then misrepresented. And the Rapa Nui watch them come and watch them go and continue the older, harder work of survival. And then there are the tablets, the Rongorongo tablets, those wooden boards incised with a script that no living person can read, that sit in museums in Santiago and Rome and Washington and St. Petersburg behind glass, catalogued and conserved and utterly silent. They are not closed books. They are unopened ones. The knowledge of how to read them died in the holds of Peruvian slave ships in 1862, died in the smallpox epidemic that the repatriated survivors carried home, died with the two hunger, the priests and scholars who were the sole living custodians of that knowledge when they were taken and not returned. One of only a handful of independent writing systems ever invented by human beings, anywhere in all of recorded history, and its key is gone. What remains are the tablets themselves, and the questions they carry, and the slow accumulation of computational tools sophisticated enough to attempt what no previous method has achieved. Those tools are only now becoming what they need to be: machine learning systems trained on undeciphered scripts, pattern recognition algorithms that can find structure in symbol sequences without knowing in advance what the structure means, comparative analyses that map Rongorongo against other Polynesian linguistic traditions, searching for the phonetic or logographic logic that might be buried in the glyphs. None of it has succeeded yet. None of it has cracked the script open and let the voice of the two hunger out into the air. But none of it has failed in the way that forecloses the possibility either. The tablets wait. The tools improve. The civilization that invented Rongorongo may yet speak, may yet tell us, in its own words, in the script it invented for itself, what it knew and what it built and what it understood about the world it inhabited. That possibility is not consolation. It is an obligation. It is the unfinished work of a reckoning that has barely begun. Because the full reckoning has not happened, the parable is still being taught. The textbooks have not all been corrected. The TED Talks are still being watched. The speeches are still being given, in rooms where decisions are made by people who believe they are drawing a lesson from history when they are in fact repeating a slander. The Williamson Balfour Company's sheep have been gone from Rapa Nui for decades, but the narrative the colonial period generated, the narrative that made the Rapa Nui responsible for their own destruction, is still grazing, still stripping the ground, still compacting the soil of public understanding so that the truth cannot take root. The Moe stand. After everything, the epidemics, the slave raids, the missionaries, the sheep, the tourists, the textbooks that turned their maker's murder into a morality play about human folly, they stand. Their backs are still to the sea. Their eyes are still turned inland, watching over the living, which is what they were built to do. They were not built as monuments to hubris. They were not built as the instruments of a civilization's suicide. They were built as ancestor figures, as the permanent gaze of the dead upon the living, as the oldest and most human of all architectural impulses. The desire to say, "We were here, we loved this place. We made something that will outlast us, and we ask only that the people who come after remember that we were real." The story of Rapa Nui is not a warning about what happens when a civilization destroys its environment. It is a warning about what happens when the world decides that some civilizations do not deserve to survive and then rewrites the evidence to make the victims responsible for their own destruction. That warning is not ancient history. It is the operating logic of the modern world. It is the logic that names the colonized as the agents of their own colonization. It is the logic that looks at a people ground down by epidemic and slavery and dispossession and says they must have done something to bring this on themselves. It is the logic that converts atrocity into parable, that launders guilt into lesson, that stands in front of the ruins it created and calls them proof. That logic is still running, and the Mu'ai are still watching.